Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Cackly Caleb. My throat is going to sound sore this week because it's filled with smoke in Colorado Springs. And in honor of that and the California wildfires, we're going to do my top 10 wildfires later on. That'll be the last segment, but we're actually going to start with some odd university grants. Germany is offering $1,900 grants for, quote, doing nothing. And then there's one in China where they're actually offering male students Chinese female companions as part of their sponsorships. Quite unorthodox. We'll get to those in the second segment. We will be doing my most bizarre stories, including a Satanist who was sentenced to 2.5 years because he was a part of a bomb plot. Also, the German government will be forcing dog owners to take their dogs for walks. Pretty interesting. And in the third final news segment, we'll wrap up with some disease stories. A lady in California actually contracted the plague, which is the first case of the plague in the past 5 years, as well as a road sleeping epidemic sweeping over Japan, due to the warm weather and heavy drinking. I can't wait to get to that one. Alright, but we're going to start off with the German university, which is offering $1,900 for, quote, doing nothing. Now, there's an easy joke in there that, I could apply for this and get it easily, but I think the easier joke to go for would be that this is the University of Fine Arts. To no one's surprise, the University of Fine Arts in Germany is offering a, quote, idleness grant, which exclusively applies to Germans willing to abstain from activity as part of a research for an exhibition on sustainability. So their theory is that if you don't do anything, you'll be able to live longer. Isn't that nice? Or perhaps it's some environmental thing. We'll get to that. Anyways, they're offering this particular grant to 3 different people, each of which will be paid $1,900 to engage in a particular form of active inactivity. These are their own words, by the way. The school goes on to add that this is a personalized idleness, saying that applicants are free to choose their own form of laziness. So they want you to get creative in your nothingness. And if you do nothing particularly well, then a panel of school officials will choose one of you to be their winner. They go on to say, quote, doing nothing isn't very easy. I should just do nothing for the next hour and it'll be called the bravest, most difficult podcast ever done. Anyway, they say doing nothing isn't very easy, and that comes from Frederick von Boris, who is the architect and design theorist who designed the program. This is what happens when you let design theorists run the school, folks. You heard it from me first. He goes on to say, we want to focus on active inactivity. If you say you are not going to move for a week, then that's impressive. If you propose you are not going to move or think, that might be even better. So if you can prove to them you're not even thinking, then you're a shoo-in for this $1,900. Or you could go, get a job or something and earn $1,900. Not saying one's better than the other, just different. And in order to create a more creative way to handle this sponsorship, Von Boris says that the period of inactivity is up to the applicant, so you can choose how long you want to be doing nothing. He says, quote, if you say you are not going to sleep, then you can only do that for a couple of days. But if you say you are not going to shop, then that's something you can sustain for a lot longer. agree to disagree on that one. The school says that the grant money will be issued when the chosen applicants submit their experience reports in mid-January of next year. And of course, the participants, quote, their reports will be paid regardless of whether their activity was successful. And of course, by activity, they mean inactivity. All submitted applicants will form part of an exhibition called the School of Inconsequentiality. Towards a Better Life. That's the full title. And that is planned for the November exhibition coming out in 2021. The main question they want to explore is, quote, what can I refrain from so that my life has fewer negative consequences on the lives of others? That is one of the silliest things I have ever heard. But they go on to explain that the idea is to explore the relationship between how society encourages sustainability and how society places value on material success. I don't know why they blame society. I always thought the individual was responsible for selfishness. But that's a whole other debate. They go on to say, quote, this scholarship program is not a joke but an experiment with serious intentions. How can you turn a society that is structured around achievements and accomplishments on its head? Only in 2020 can we be aiming to destroy achievements and accomplishments. Alright, time to move on to our next weird sponsorship story from universities. The university in China, the Shandong University, that's the last time I'm going to say that, is offering male students a, quote, Chinese female companion as part of their sponsorship. So this was all revealed by a young, nice lady named Nancy Lee, who, quote, is a petite, soft-mannered Chinese girl in her early 20s, good lord, who is now working as an accountant for a Fortune 500 company, who recounts being assigned to a foreign male classmate as his female companion when she was a freshman in college. Now, it must be noted that Nancy herself actually received state sponsorship for the scholarship, as she agreed to participate in the, quote, female companion sponsorship. Nancy went on to say that not everybody would be selected for this sponsorship. According to her, the females must be, quote, attractive, white-skinned, and gentle-mannered. Oh my gosh, this is kind of gross. This is government-sponsored in China. But that's not where it ends. It actually gets much more bizarre. Every foreign male student is actually assigned 3 different Chinese female student companions who accompany the foreign students to each class lunch and dinner. It is said that beyond school hours, they also participate in extracurricular programs and parties, sometimes even sleepovers, which take place in all-male dormitories. Now, I'm going to read a quote from Nancy, which gets a little steamy. In the most unfortunate ways, quote, we must give in to the demands of those foreign students, and if they complain to the university that the male-female companions are not cooperative, we would lose our sponsorship and might even be expelled. Many were coerced into having sex with those foreign students. I have witnessed firsthand a foreign student beating a female companion for refusing sexual advance. Oh, well, that took a dark turn, didn't it? So many people are theorizing that this is part of a program that is designed to make foreigners have a positive outlook on China. So foreigners come into the university, and while they're studying, they get 3 ladies to hang out with them all the time, and then they have a positive lookout on the country itself. Which is why it's sponsored by the Chinese government. Pretty disgusting stuff. In fact, it is said that sex between female and male students in the Chinese female companionship program is so commonplace that, quote, every night we could hear those Chinese girls moaning in the foreign students' dormitory. That came from a former Shandong University student who wishes to remain anonymous, which is also quite horrifying. I can imagine the only reason Nancy came out about this and used her actual name is because she's no longer living in China. I cannot imagine they would look fondly upon this. It is said that the university has a zero-tolerance policy against Chinese students who are disrespectful to foreign students. Any Chinese student who, quote, expresses resentment of foreign students will be disciplined up to and including expulsion from the university. All right, now I'm going to read this final statement, and it gets very, very graphic. So if you don't want to hear that, if you want to have it does have sort of a happy ending, but if you want to kind of avoid the 5-minute long story that it takes to get to that happy ending, just go ahead and skip ahead about 5 minutes, and we'll get into my next segment, which is about like mountain goats and Florida people being Florida people. So if you want to get back to the fun stuff, skip ahead about 5 minutes. But now I'm going to read this statement, quite graphic, and here we go. One time we were all invited to attend a party for foreign students. They forced us to drink a lot of alcohol. When one of the female companions refused, she was slapped hardly across her face. Another tried to intervene, but the guy grabbed her hair and dragged her across the floor. We were all really scared. If we leave, they threatened to complain, and we would all be disciplined by the university. When they got really drunk, they started to tear at our clothes and fondle our breasts. If we tried to resist, they would hit us. They slapped and twisted my nipples, and I was in tears. The party continued until midnight, and some female companions were so drunk that they had passed out. None of us were allowed to leave until we all had sex with at least one foreign student. 3 of us, the female companions, were pushed on the bottom row of the bunker beds, and they took turn having sex with us. None of them used a condom. We felt violated and wanted to report the incident to the police, but we did not do that. The university would have expelled us. Pretty horrific stuff, and it actually gets more horrific. Nancy goes on to say, quote, in order to not make a scene, all of us took morning after pills. There was one really unfortunate girl who did not. She was forced to have an abortion by the university and became a campus-wide scandal. Now, I know I promised this had a happy ending. Apparently Nancy said she, quote, also felt happy. Quote, it gave me experience with foreign men and helped me to grow as a person. I'm now married to a white American man, and my experience as a female companion to foreign men definitely helped to understand foreign culture better. So, I don't really understand that last quote. It kind of seems like it would be the opposite of all that she took away from this experience, but, I wasn't in that experience, so I would not know. Helped to understand foreign culture better. Helped to understand Bill Cosby better, maybe. This is such a sad, sad story. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to wrap up this segment in a happy story. It's not so much happy as it is funny. A Florida man involved in a DUI golf cart crash claims that the president is responsible for him drinking. This is our first Florida story of the week. And apparently he was drunk and crashed his golf cart while driving through the villages of Florida. And for those who don't know, The Villages is actually a town in Florida. Very clever name. Deputies say that they were called to a single-vehicle golf cart crash on the evening of July 30th. They were questioning the driver, who was actually an 82-year-old man. He said that he hit a wall inside the golf cart tunnel while driving home. It was quickly observed by the officers that the man was completely drunk, and when questioned, the man claimed that only 2 hours prior he was watching the president speak on TV and, quote, then got really mad and what he said. That's not a sentence. So he started drinking vodka, according to the authorities. Which, if you ask me, is a proper response to watching anything political. The drunken 82-year-old goes on to say that although he has been drinking, he is okay to drive. The police obviously disagreed, gave him a breath test, and showed that his alcohol content was 0.149. Goodness gracious. He was arrested on a DUI charge. That was a pretty funny story. Alright, stay tuned to the next segment, where I'll give you another Florida story about a lady who gets locked inside a gun safe, as well as a Satanist who was arrested as being part of a bomb plot. Very exciting stuff. Stay tuned for all of that.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We are now going to take part in the goofiest news stories of the week. Stay tuned and I'll get to my top 10 wildfires of all time, thanks to California and Colorado being completely burnt to a crisp during this horrible 2020 summer. But for now, let's jump into the goofy news. A teen gets locked in a showroom safe at an Orlando gun range. I'm going to go ahead and mention that she was uninjured. So this whole incident took place at Shooters World. So in Florida, you have Water World, you have Disney World, and you have Shooters World. Something for everybody. I don't know why I can't stop laughing about that. Anyways, apparently they were showing off a giant gun safe, which was left wide open for some reason. And a teenager decided to walk into it. A young teenage lady decided to walk into it. And once she was inside, the display door closed behind her and locked. Goodness gracious, that's not okay. I have a perfect Jerry Seinfeld joke for this one. Why is it called a safe? It should be called a dangerous. Alright, sorry about that. So crews quickly responded to the Shooters World incident. And the firefighters could not unlock the safe. Apparently there's a safety key just in case something like this happens, and the key was not working. Once again, why is it called a safe? As a result, the firefighters had to use a hydraulic extracting tool system in order to breach the door. Quote, "We tried the manufacturer's suggestions, and unfortunately the failsafe system failed on it. We were forced to use special team units, which used their special hydraulic tools to reach the wall." Which is a Florida way of saying they used tools to open the door. According to the fire department, the teenager was not injured during the incident, nor after the incident, and she also remained calm during the entire ordeal. Pretty impressive. I would have been freaking out like nobody else. Apparently, crews had to be cautious to ensure the young girl's safety, and were able to communicate with her the entire time. Quote, "We were able to tell the minor that we were doing from the outside so they would not be too concerned or scared, and we had them back away as far as possible from our entry point, which provided her safety." Well, isn't that fine? Fine and dandy. Okay, so, the moral of this story, don't leave safe doors open. Okay, next story. So, 325 mountain goats were flown out of Olympics National Park in order to preserve its economic system. That's really odd. So this effort began 2 years ago as part of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Organization, who moved the goats from the Olympic National Forest to the 12 sites in North Cascades. Apparently in 2018, they were planning to remove 725 goats, but that number quickly got cut in half as a result of most of them dying. Goodness gracious. Apparently that was part of the effort, was relocating them because the area was not suited for them. People brought them there about 2 decades ago, and since then they have not been living a fulfilling life, according to the scientists. I wonder what a fulfilling life looks like for a goat. In addition to the 325 goats that were relocated, 16 were brought to a zoo, 22 died while being captured, and 4 died in transport. And they go on to shamefully admit that 8 of the goats that could not be safely captured were killed. That's not right. So the scientist in charge also goes on to mention that part of the problem is that these goats got addicted to human pee and sweat smells which led to many confrontations, which apparently led to several people getting injured. Apparently their desire for sweat is because they don't get enough salt in this particular region, which is part of what determined where they shipped the goats in the first place. It's pretty entertaining to watch. If you want to go online, you can watch a video of a helicopter with 2 goats hanging from it. It's very entertaining if you want to go look at that for about 30 seconds. Now, the goat scientist wraps up his little canard saying that this is mostly in an effort to preserve the conservationist efforts of the Olympic Mountains. Apparently the goats are devastating the ecosystem. I don't know much about goats, people. What I do know is that it's funny to watch them fly while hanging from helicopters. And also, those are actually the lucky goats. Any remaining goats will be hunted down this fall by volunteer hunters. Goodness gracious, these scientists are out of control, mad with power. So, if you live in Washington and were wondering where all your tax dollars were going, it's to fly around goats. Alright, next story. Back to Florida. Wait, we already did that one. Back to Kansas, where an ex-soldier described by prosecutors as a Satanist gets linked to neo-Nazi groups which are trying to bomb people. If you couldn't think of a more inflammatory story, here you go. Last Wednesday, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison for disturbing information through social media about building a bomb and making napalm. Goodness gracious, why would you share that on social media? The federal judge in question refused a request from the man's attorney for a, quote, lenient sentence. The defense was asking for only 15 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. However, federal law calls for a 3-year and up to 20 years in prison, as well as a fine of $250,000 as a result of this kind of crime. However, the judge presumed that punishment for the first-time offender should only be 2.5 years, possibly reaching the 3-year minimum requirement, as the man did not seem capable of pursuing his actual threats. What a pathetic thing to have on your resume. The judge said that he was surprised that federal sentencing guidelines call for such a, quote, low prison sentence for troubling and serious criminal behavior. He went on to add that, quote, the man wanted to start a race war and shared on social media multi-step plans to create chaos. His planned actions, if executed, would have endangered countless members of the public. So to me, the really funny part of this story is that the man plays the victim card as part of his, quote, seeking of a lighter sentence. His attorney said that, quote, because of a cleft lip and palate, Smith had endured a lifetime of victimization, isolation, and trauma, which led him to become involved with online extremist groups. The Anti-Defamation League said, quote, Smith was associated with the neo-Nazi division, which says it advocates for race war and promotes some of the most extreme views of the white supremacist movement. And the defense is arguing that that is because he had a cleft lip. The man arrested was only 24 years old and has been serving in the military since he was 18. The defense went on to say, quote, he's not far removed from adolescence. He is particularly vulnerable to extremists online. He's just a boy. Let him be a neo-Nazi. Prosecutors responded by saying that Smith planned to overthrow the government. Apparently, he had admitted to providing information about making explosives to an FBI undercover agent, and the FBI bomb technicians determined that his recipes were, in fact, viable. That's a pretty good response to the defense saying he's young. The man said that attacking news organizations would be his first step towards anarchy, and he apparently went on to say that he distributed explosives information as, quote, part of the glory for his Satanist religion. They go on to prove his devotion towards Satan by showing off his iPod, which has a lot of black metal music on it. Kind of a goofy argument, but I think it's funny. Anyways, apparently this Satanist black metal music listener went on to actually send encrypted communications with a Missouri man who actually planned to bomb a Kansas City area hospital because he was distressed by the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. However, that man ended up killing himself during a firefight with FBI agents as they served an arrest warrant as part of an FBI order. Atop that accusation, the man actually admitted and said that he added this on top of the fact that he was communicating with a terrorist. He went on to say that he wanted to join a Ukraine violent right-wing paramilitary group. Yeah, that's going to help your case, buddy. Now, in the man's defense, this part's kind of sad, actually. Apparently, he endured nearly daily barrage of bullying as a child and had repeated painful reconstruction surgeries on his face, which led to more bullying. In 2010, when he was a freshman in high school, he actually learned that he was on one of his classmates' quote, hit list. He was actually an intended target of a school shooting and bomb plot. So these kids in school intended to not only shoot him, but also bomb him. Goodness gracious. Thankfully, that attempt was thwarted. Quote, that had a huge impact on who you are, didn't it? That's what the defendant told his own defense-e. Despite those tragic childhood events, it was determined that the man was not suffering from a goddamn mental illness, and as a result, the judge said, quote, what the defendant experienced is sad, and I have sympathy for him, but it has to be balanced against what he did. And that is how the story ends. All we can do now is hope that this man has an American History X moment in prison and finally realizes the error of his ways. Okay, next story. So I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more stories in this segment. Walkers could become the law for German dog owners, which is a roundabout way of saying that taking your dog for at least 2 walks a day, or at least for an hour a day, could soon become the law in Germany. The law is also being attempted to be passed along with a law stating that dogs cannot be chained for long periods of time. Rules are also being devised to crack down on, quote, puppy farms, banning breeders from looking after more than 3 litters at any one time. The agricultural minister of Germany said, quote, pets are not cuddly toys. Their needs have to be taken into account. I personally don't understand the binary. I think both can be true. Apparently, under the new planned rules, the dog owners, quote, will have to take their dog for walks twice a day for a minimum of 1 hour in total. They will also not be allowed to keep their dogs chained for long periods of time, and, quote, will not be allowed to leave dogs alone for the whole day. As a result of these laws, breeders would be restricted from looking after a maximum of 3 litters, and puppies would have to spend a minimum of 4 hours per day in human company in order to ensure that they get socialized. The agricultural minister went on to say, quote, these changes are based on expert advice to ensure the animals' protection and welfare. It is said that the draft for the new regulations has already been drawn up and will likely become law early next year. If passed, it will be up to German states to enforce it, however. After the laws were accused of being both vague and strict, a spokeswoman for the agricultural ministry said that it was very unlikely a private dog owner would receive police visits to check whether they had taken their pooch for a walk. She also said, quote, the emphasis would be on ensuring that the dogs kept in kennels were treated well. I don't know why they don't then just put that in the law, perhaps because it is easier to enforce things when they are vague. Germany has a kind of a rough past with that whole kind of thing. I probably should cut that out, but I'm not going to. And in typical German fashion, a ban is also being planned on show dogs, which have their ears and tails docked, in contravention of animal protection rules. Contravention is a beautiful word. It's like convention, but it's contra, so it's against against convention. Dogs whose behavior is not, quote, species appropriate will also be banned from dog shows. Goodness gracious, dog racism going on here. And on her final sign-off, the agricultural minister concludes that the new rules will also prevent transporting cattle with time over 4.5 hours. So you'll no longer be able to transport cattle more than 4.5 hours distance. So that's kind of funny. Let me know what you think about these laws. I was kind of hard on them. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Well, for now, we gotta go to break. Stay tuned to the next segment where we will go over some disease-related stories. A lady contracted the plague. That's exciting. And after that, we'll do my top 10 wildfires in honor of the country being on fire. Stay tuned for that.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We're going to dive right into some god-dang disease-related stories. Stay tuned. We'll do the top 10 wildfires next. Alright, so we're going to start off with a California resident who tested positive for the plague, which is actually the first case of the plague in the state in 5 years. It is also my duty to note that here in Colorado Springs we had a squirrel who contracted the Black Plague, so it is no doubt spreading and is going to kill us all probably. Unless you wear a mask, of course, then you'll be fine. So this occurred in El Dorado County, where health officials were notified by the California Department of Public Health that a resident in South Lake Tahoe had tested positive for the plague, and that it is thought that the person, who is an avid walker, may have been bitten by an infected flea while walking their dog along the Truckee River corridor, according to a statement released by El Dorado County last month. The patient who tested positive is, of course, currently under the care of the medical professionals in her local area and is receiving treatment at her home to prevent further spreading of the disease. Health and Human Services went on to warn that, quote, once transmitted symptoms of the plague usually show up within 2 weeks of exposure to an infected animal or flea, and that the symptoms can include fever, nausea, weakness, and swollen lymph nodes. Of course, the plague is deadly, but if it is detected early, it can be effectively treated with antibiotics. Quote, plague is naturally present in many parts of California, including higher elevation areas of El Dorado County. It's important that individuals take precautions for themselves and their pets when outdoors, especially while walking, hiking, and or camping in areas where wild rodents are present. Human cases of plague are extremely rare, but can be very serious. That quote was said by the El Dorado County Public Health Officer, Dr. Nancy Williams. The El Dorado Public Health Officer, that's the coolest title of all time. And according to Nancy, she went on to say that the CDPH routinely monitors rodent populations for plague activity in California. From 2016 to 2019, authorities discovered a total of 20 rodents with evidence of exposure to the plague bacterium in the South Lake Tahoe area, but there were no reports of plague-associated illness during that time. As a matter of fact, quote, the last reported case of plague in California were 2 human cases which were exposed to infected rodents and their fleas in Yosemite National Park in 2015. The El Dorado County Health and Human Services said in a statement, quote, both people were treated and recovered. These were the first reported human cases in the states since 2016. So that was almost a decade. So this doesn't happen very often. However, if you start coughing and, a black piece of lung comes up, you might want to contact your local GP. Of course, since the announcement of the first case of the plague in 5 years, several areas in the South Lake Tahoe area now have signs posted, and they are warning people of the presence of the plague in that area, as well as ways to prevent potential exposure. This includes not feeding wild animals, not touching skin or dead animals, protecting your pets with flea control products, and wearing long goddamn pants and using insect repellent. Now, my favorite part of this article is when they actually go into the history of the Black Plague, and I am not going to skip out on an opportunity to go back into history. Quote, arguably the most infamous plague outbreak was the so-called Black Death, a multi-century pandemic which swept through Asia and Europe. According to National Geographic, it was believed to have started in China in 1334. It spread along trade routes and reached Europe via Silicon ports in the late 1340s. The plague killed an estimated 25 million people, which was almost a third of the continent's population at the time. The Black Death lingered on for centuries, particularly in cities. Outbreaks included the Great Plague of London, which occurred from 1665 to 66, in which 70,000 residents died. Despite all that, the CDC says there is now only an average of 7 human plague cases per year across the entire world, and the WHO says the mortality rate is estimated to be between 8 and 10%. Well, that was a fun story about diseases. We're going to move on now to a, quote, road sleeping epidemic, which hit Okinawa as a result of warm weather and heavy drinking. Now, this story begins by noting that Japan is actually largely tolerant of salarymen snoozing on trains after an evening out due to the fact that people in Japan work insane hours when compared to the rest of the world. Despite this, local police in Okinawa are reporting that 7,000 cases of literally sleeping on the road occurred in the last year alone, a phenomenon which some attribute to Okinawa's balmy weather and enthusiastic consumption of a fiery spirit that has been made on the island for hundreds of years. So it's a combination of heat and drink, which I can say from personal experience does make me a bit sleepy. Police in Japan's southernmost prefecture, located 1,000 miles from Tokyo, are thought to be the only force in the country that keeps statistics on the sleeping pandemic. In fact, the police chief himself said, quote, I didn't even know the term rojni, which is the term they use for falling asleep on the road, before coming to Okinawa. I think it's a phenomenon unique to Okinawa. Thankfully, it is noted that in most instances, people are awakened from their impromptu slumber before coming into any harm. But of course, it shall be noted that 16 of the 7,221 cases of this disease reported last year resulted in accidents, 3 of which were fatal. Restrictions on Japan's nighttime economy prompted by the coronavirus outbreak has failed to slow the trend, unfortunately. In the past 6 months of this year alone, police received 2,702 cases, each of which resulted in an emergency call form factor, which was about the same number as the same point last year. Despite government requests for people not to venture out at night, this pandemic is still ongoing. Locals blame this pandemic on the warm weather and a combination of a rice-based spirit unique to the island that is usually drunk with water and ice. And as a result of these rumors being promulgated, it is now a criminal offense that can lead to a fine of up to 50,000 yen if you drink this drink. The government also sponsored radio broadcasts, which promoted a photo exhibition warning of the dangers of this disease. However, it did not appear to have convinced drinkers to stop, while they are still capable of making it safely to their own beds. In some cases, police have come across, quote, victims under the curb as a cooling pillow. So they'll stick their heads between the grates of a sidewalk and the actual road and use it as a pillow. And apparently others have even stripped down to their underwear, apparently in the belief that they are already home. Police are particularly worried for this summer, as it is said to be one of the hotter summers in Japan's history. And as a result, the head of the prefectural police traffics division said that officers show little mercy to habitual offenders. He also called on residents to moderate their owamari consumption. That's the wine spirit. Quote, "Don't get me wrong, alcohol isn't bad. It's just bad to drink in excess." A brilliant quote from Japan's chief of police. Not Japan, Okinawa's. Okay, next disease story. So I'm not going to spoil this story. I'm just going to tell it in a story format. So this all began in France, where a young man was refusing to get off a train after refusing to wear his face mask. Of course, in France, it is required that you wear face masks while on public transport. The man was on the TGV Paris-Nice service on the 16th of August, and he was asked to put on a face covering, which he refused. As a result, the decision was made to take an unscheduled stop so that the man could be kicked off the train. However, the train does not normally stop before reaching its destination of Marsville, Marseille, Marselle, but railway security opted to eject the traveler at Cresseux, in the region of eastern France. There's just one problem, though. It was around 470 kilometers away from the next scheduled stop. Apparently, the man was also fined 135 euros for failing to comply with the rules. Quote, "It is a shame that we ended up there, but the safety and security of all is our top priority," which is a direct quote of the general manager of the train itself. He went on to say, quote, "Our SNCF security agents are sworn in and authorized to issue a fine for not wearing a mask, and are also able to make disobedient people leave the train for, quote, disturbing public order." One of the ladies on the train who witnessed the incident said, quote, "My TGV made an exceptional stop in the middle of nowhere to kick out a guy who refused to wear a mask. We're not supposed to stop before Marseille, but the guy finds himself in the depths of Burgundy." So they kicked the man off the train in the middle of nowhere. I think a couple dozen miles away from any other location of merit. The lady went on to say, quote, "Well done, sir. You have proven to two controllers and your statement that you are a real rebel at heart. Welcome back home. Enjoy the Burgundy countryside." The SNCF told the French newspaper that, quote, "Travelers generally respect wearing masks, and in fact more than 95% of all travelers respect the instructions, and most of the remaining 5% agree to wear one after being asked." A nice happy ending, and we're going to end on the happiest story of the god-dang week, when a stranger hands out cash to people waiting for stimulus checks. Apparently, the witnesses say that the man didn't identify himself or asks for any thanks before driving away. This happened in Portland, Oregon, when thousands of Oregonians waited for a long line at credit unions across the state on Thursday to apply for a $500 emergency relief check. But people at one location were left with more than they expected. One lady said that she was waiting for her check with hundreds of other people last Thursday morning when a man drove up in a Jaguar. She said he seemed irritated at first that people were blocking the ATM, but those gathered explained that they were waiting for emergency funding. The man was said to have asked, "Really? You guys need help?" And when she answered yes, he did something that restored her faith in humanity. All of a sudden, he breaks open a stack of $100 bills, and he said, "Distribute this down the line." He just said here, sorry, like I said, I'm sick because of the smoke. He said, "Here, take it, and don't ask for any thanks." He just drove off. Apparently, the man handed out over $10,000, Quote, he actually broke the band off it, so that means it was $10,000, at least $3,000, maybe the whole $10,000, and it was just distributed to everyone in line. I know they're speaking in broken English, but I'm gonna continue with the quote anyways. Quote, all of us in line, we wanted to say thank you so much, whoever you are. You are a saint. There were black people, white people, men, women, Catholics, and people with Jewish star necklaces. Handed it out to all of us. Didn't matter who we were. Women in burqas and every manner of walk of life. And he helped all of us. Goodness gracious. I'd like to edit the quotes so that they were actually full sentences, but I'm not allowed to do that legally, so I will not. So, despite my incompetent stuttering, that's a great, happy story to end the news cycle on. And we're now going to go to break. Stay tuned. I'll get to my top 10 wildfires in all of history. That's going to be exciting. Stay tuned for that.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We're going to get into my top 10 wildfires in all of history, starting with, you guessed it, number 10, Boston in 1872, which was arguably the most expensive in terms of property damage in any American fire in history. This was due to the fact that most of the damage was confined to the city's downtown areas and financial districts, very devastating to the economic standing of Boston itself, and it resulted in thousands of Bostonians losing their jobs and even hundreds of businesses being closed or destroyed. In fact, it was so expensive that dozens of insurance companies even went bankrupt just trying to pay out the damages. Fairly unfortunate. However, even more unfortunate, the fire might have never have done so much damage if it weren't for the city's overworked fire department, which had not been burdened with everything from locked fire alarm boxes, which had to be ordered by the city to be locked in order to prevent false alarms, as well as low water pressures and non-standardized fire hydrant couplings. So they would get to the fire and they wouldn't be able to put their hoses on the fire hydrants because they did not fit. Kind of a big problem. In the end, the comedy of errors resulted in 65 acres of downtown Boston being burnt, including some 776 buildings and 20 people being turned into charred cinders, making it one of the East Coast's most devastating fires. Alright, number 9, London in 1212, a long time ago, if you're not good at math. It is much less known than the fire of 1666, which we will get to later. The fire apparently devastated London, to the point where it was named the Great Fire of Southwark. I love their town names, it's hilarious. Apparently, it was so deadly that it left 3,000 people dead, many of whom died while they were trapped on the engulfing London Bridge. Of course, this is not the London Bridge that is famous. It is, in fact, a one that was made entirely of highly flammable wood, which was waterproofed. And apparently it was made of even more flammable tar. While figures on the numbers of buildings that were destroyed will never be known, the fire gutted much of the area of the South London residencies, which left about a third of the old city in ruins. Of course, it wasn't the first fire to ravage London during its history, as part of the city burned in 1130 and again in 1135. Not a great history when it comes to flames. I don't know why they made their bridge waterproof. Apparently later fires, such as the one in 1666, were even more devastating, but like I said earlier, we will get to that. Alright, number 8, Chicago, 1871. In which probably a few infernos have been the cause of such a disaster. And I didn't know this because I'm not a big fan of Chicago, but apparently it's one of the most famous fires in all of history. It occurred in October of 1871 and left nearly 17,000 structures burned and 90,000 people homeless. Fortunately, it spread slowly enough that fewer than 300 people died in flames, but that's of little consolation to those who were forced to face a cold Midwestern winter without their homes. Of course, for those who don't know Chicago, like me, Chicago is very, very cold. It is said that the fire started in a barn on the O'Leary property at 1370 Kevon Street. There is no evidence that it was caused by a woman's cow kicking over their lantern, which is the common myth told when describing how this fire began. Apparently that story was made up by a newspaper reporter who later admitted he did so because he thought it made for a more colorful story. Beyond that, modern researchers have instead come up with a hypothesis that it might have actually been started by a transient smoking in the barn and inadvertently setting the hay inside on fire. In any case, like the London fire of 1666, which we'll get to next, the fire paved the way for a new and improved Chicago to rise from the ashes that would, within a few short decades, make it the great metropolis it is today. Of course, the same argument is used in San Francisco and in Yellowstone. We'll get to those too. It is also said that it led to much-needed firefighting reforms that would one day make Chicago's fire department one of the best in the country, and it would be a template by which the other large cities' fire departments would base their own procedures on. Alright, the promised London fire of 1666. While England's modern capital has burned many times, as previously mentioned, largely due to its wooden construction and overall poor design, it was the Great Inferno of 1666 that is best remembered. This is largely because of the impact it had on the citizens not only of London, but of all of England. Thankfully, it was largely non-lethal. By all accounts, only 6 people died in the flames. However, the interesting thing about this fire, which was apparently started when a maid forgot to douse the fires in her baker's shop, was that, much like the fire in Chicago, it actually proved unintentionally beneficial. The area of the city that was most thoroughly destroyed was said to have been the filthy slums, which people had already largely moved out of. It was associated with the Great Plague that had swept through the city the previous summer. As a result, it is said that the fire effectively cleansed the area in a way even sterilizing the city could not. The technology simply wasn't there to sterilize at the time without the use of fire, and thankfully, nature took care of that for us. It is said that it made a fresh canvas of the England area, upon which they were set to rebuild their great city. So that's happy. However, the biggest problem was that it displaced a lot of citizens, a lot of the poorest citizens, a lot of the sickest citizens, and unfortunately their story will not be told, as most of them died. More people actually died as a result of the evacuation, rather than burning up in flames. Alright, let's move on to number 6. San Francisco, 1906. I should probably put this one higher, but I'm not going to. The fire that burned 25,000 buildings over 490 city blocks left some 3,000 people dead, and most importantly, was both man-made and natural. Of course, it was natural because it was created by an earthquake, a massive earthquake, that hit the city in the pre-dawn hours of April 18th, 1906, and it was also partly man-made, as many of the destroyed structures were the result of clumsy efforts by untrained and poorly led firefighters to dynamite largely intact buildings in the attempt to create fire breaks. We had the same problem in Colorado a couple years ago. We had a big fire in Black Forest, and in order to stop the fire, we decided to burn down some other trees in order to create a gap so the fire couldn't transfer to the larger part of the forest. Turns out setting fire on the gap caused the fire to grow. Didn't go so well at all. However, it was much worse in San Francisco, as some people estimate that this may have accounted for as many as 50% of the buildings that were destroyed during the incident, which would have otherwise survived. Another big problem was that the earthquake, which was in fact one of the largest in American history, destroyed all of the water mains in San Francisco, which didn't help at all. But an even bigger problem was that the city was in serious straits prior to the quake, as a result of the corrupt and unresponsive city government that diverted money intended for emergencies to, quote, other projects, leaving firefighters without proper equipment. Finally, and as if that wasn't all enough, the one man most capable of successfully coordinating firefighting efforts, Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, died in the initial earthquake, which left the firefighters without central leadership. Quite devastating. Okay, number 5, Wisconsin in 1871. Many people have heard of the Great Fire of Chicago. Not many people have heard of the Great Fire of Wisconsin, which in fact took place in the same time period and was just a few hundred miles away. This fire would end up being responsible for more deaths by fire than any other in U.S. history. The number is so high that many people don't even know the exact number. It is said that the fire scorched an area twice the size of the state of Rhode Island, and casualty estimates are around 2.5 thousand. It is said that the entire town of Prestego, which only had a population of 1,700, died in the flames. That is brutal. Apparently many of their bodies were never recovered, and many of the survivors escaped the flames by immersing themselves in the river itself in order to survive. This led to many, many people drowning who were also never found. Of course, the rivers up there are quite cold. Many hypothermia cases are suspected to have occurred. It is also said by witnesses reporting that the firestorm was so great that it generated tornadoes that threw rail cars hundreds of feet and flung entire houses into the air. Pretty brutal stuff. Should get more attention, but it won't, because you know, Wisconsin. Alright, number 4, Texas City, Texas, 1947. So this is a pretty interesting story. You've probably heard of it. Apparently there was a small fire on a docked freighter, one of those shipping ships, and it wasn't expected to be that big of a problem. It was just a small fire. However, the vessel was actually carrying 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the result being the largest industrial explosion in U.S. history. It was said to be so massive that the burst resulted from the fertilizer explosion, left over 1,000 buildings knocked over, and 600 people dead or missing, including the entire Texas City Volunteer Fire Department. So, apparently there were very few first responders who could respond to this because they were already on the ship trying to put out the fire when it exploded. Quite tragic, in fact. It is said that the explosion was so big that people felt the shock wave about 250 miles away, and windows up to only 40 miles away were shattered. One of the sightseeing airplanes was actually knocked out of the sky, and the anchor of the freight ship was actually launched about a mile away through the air. And it was actually recent enough that you can go online and watch some videotape of it. Pretty interesting stuff. Moving on to number 3, which is a similar story to the last one. Halifax in Nova Scotia, 1917, World War I vessel, and it was filled with many, many armory materials, such as bomb, building material, and also basic munitions. It occurred in Halifax Harbor, of course, when the ship, the Mont Blanc, caught fire. Now, the interesting thing is it did not simply catch fire, it actually crashed into another Norwegian freighter. And before the flames could be brought under control, they touched off the highly volatile ammunition, resulting in an explosion that was so powerful that it caused a tsunami in the local area. Estimates are said that it blew with a force of 3 kilotons of TNT, which is so powerful that a pressure wave of air snapped trees, bent iron rails, and demolished buildings. The devastating effects didn't stop there, as it is said the next day a blizzard hit the city, which hampered the effects to rescue people from their collapsed homes, as well as misplaced people freezing to death in the cold of Nova Scotia. It is said that over 2,000 people died and 9,000 people were left injured, and the city was left in ruins. Alright, number 2, Tokyo, Japan, 1923. Much like San Francisco, the city of Tokyo was also leveled by a massive earthquake, which started a fire which resulted in many deaths, some estimated as high as 142,000. It is said that in one event alone, approximately 38,000 people were packed into an open space in downtown Tokyo, where they were incinerated by the firestorm-influenced fire whirl, kind of like mentioned before in Wisconsin, a fire tornado. Pretty upsetting stuff. It is said that the earthquake and the fire and a tsunami that resulted later ended up with a total destruction toll of 570,000 homes, which left a staggering 1.9 million people homeless, being known as Japan's Doomsday. And of course, legend has it that Tokyo was rebuilt just in time for World War II to occur, in which American B-29 bombers incinerated the city again with firebombs. Quite unfortunate. Alright, time for number 1, Rome in 64 AD. I know I'm going way back for this one, but that is because there is so much fun legend involved with it. Basically, it is said that flames gutted the heart of the capital of the Roman Empire. There are a couple famous, unproven stories, such as that the current emperor, Emperor Nero, just played with his little fiddle while the entire city burned. Now, most people don't believe that happened, mostly because the fiddle wasn't invented yet. But it could be possible that he was just gallivanting during the entire thing. He's well known to be insane. Anyways, the priests of the city actually blame the fire on Nero, who said that he had the city put to a torch as part of a plan to clear out choice pieces of real estate, upon which he would later build his new palace. But of course, this is also unproven. However, what is known is that it spread quickly and burned for about 5.5 days, leaving 10 to 14 districts in Rome completely destroyed. It is also well known that even if Nero didn't start the fire, sounds like a horrible protest song, he blamed it on local Christians, and many of them were actually set to blaze as a response to this fire, or they would be murdered by being fed to lions. Pretty horrific stuff. And to further ruin the name of Emperor Nero, he actually did end up building his palace on the burned grounds. So, yeah, just a lot of scandal going on in that story, which is why it's my favorite. But that's it for this goddamn podcast, so why don't you go ahead and subscribe to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Leave a like or a comment. I'd like to know what you guys think about how this episode was slightly more serious than other episodes. It's possibly just because I'm sick and in a bad mood that I let that happen. However, I'd like to know what you think. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And keep in touch. Have a good week. Bye-bye, folks.